What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. Today's video, we're going to take a little break from our seasonal videos before the finale coming out next week and bring you what we're considering a little bit of a gimmicky game, but it's more just of a themed game, and it's a pod full of 4 mono-colored commanders. The commanders we chose for this were ones that we were just interested in playing and thought would be interesting, and the commanders we decided on were Naru Meha, Master Wizard, Muxus, Goblin Grandee, Sram, Senior Edificer, and Omnath, Locus of Mana. We played a few games of this pod and decided to pick 2 of them out for a doubleheader today. But before we get into game number 1, we have a few quick channel promotions. First off, if you want to help support the channel financially, we have a Patreon link in the description for those who want to and are able to. And if you are one of those patrons, thank you guys so much. You guys are fantastic and you do really help the channel go a long way. And as an added benefit for the month of August, patrons of the tier Lightly Played and above can submit deck lists for our upcoming season, season number 4, where we're going to have an entire season dedicated to budgeted cEDH deck lists, and anyone of the tier Lightly Played or above, or any Twitch subscribers or YouTube members of the same tier, are able to submit deck lists. You can find more information by going to the community tab on our YouTube channel. We made a post recently that outlines some of the specifics. In the description, you can also find a link to our merch store if you want to pick up some casually competitive merch. Another option to support us is, if you're planning on buying cards in the near future, click on our TCG affiliate link in the description before you purchase them, and then any purchases you make after that will directly help the channel at no cost to you. And finally, we have a Flipside Gaming affiliate where, if you use our code CasuallyMTG at checkout, on eligible purchases, you will not only save 10%, but you will also be helping the channel. So now, without any further ado, let's get into the opening hands and deck introductions. Going first today is myself, Joseph, playing Naru Meha, Master Wizard. Now, the goal of this deck is not too far-fetched. It's obviously to control the board with just being a mono-blue player, but the combo that is used to win is a little bit unique to this deck, utilizing Ghostly Flicker and Naru Meha to essentially blink a permanent infinite time, so something like a Sun-Scorched Desert, or something to generate infinite mana and then use an outlet to win the game. We chose this deck because out of all the mono blue decks, we felt this would probably be the most balanced in this pod, and let's be honest, you can't have a semi-competitive game without a little bit of blue. My opening hand contained 3 islands, a rapid hybridization, a Tolarian Winds, a Sapphire Medallion, and a Ghostly Flicker. Going second is Nate, playing Muxus, Goblin Grandee. Now, as a seasoned Cranko player, he's very comfortable building mono-red goblins, and this deck is just packed full of these combos. It utilizes cards like Goblin Recruiter to stack the top of his deck and then win once Muxus resolves. Nate's opening hand contained 2 snow-covered mountains, a Hanowar Battlements, a Warren Instigator, a Goblin Rabblemaster, Cranko Tin Street Kingpin, and Ogre Battle Driver. Going third is Jordan, playing Omnath, Locus of Mana, with the main focus to just generate a lot of mana, store it up for a later turn, and then just have a massive final turn where he just casts massive spells and overruns the board. Jordan's opening hand contained 2 snow-covered forests, a Mana Crypt, a Veil of Summer, a Helix Pinnacle, an Occam Adversary, and a Pathbreaker Ibex. And finally, going last is Bill, playing Sram, Senior Edificer. Now, we've all heard that White has a relatively hard time drawing cards, so Bill built this deck in order to break the mold and just draw as many cards as possible. So he's playing a deck that's full of very low cost, if not free, equipments, auras, and enchantments. The way this deck normally wins is either through taking advantage of all of these cheap equipments with something like Balan Wandering Knight and just swinging out to win, or through generating infinite mana through a Bomberman combo and then winning with a Walking Ballista. Bill's opening hand contained a Plains, a Gemstone Caverns, a Hall of Heliod's Generosity, a Bonesaw, an Avacyn's Collar, and All That Glitters, and a Darksteel Mutation. Now remember, if you want to watch these games live, head on over to our Twitch channel, link in the description, where we stream these games every Sunday. And now with the introduction over, let's get into the gameplay. Joseph goes to start his turn, but before he draws, Bill has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Hall of Heliod's Generosity and putting a luck counter on his caverns. Joseph then goes to his turn, draws, plays an island, and then passes. Nate, on his turn, plays a snow-covered mountain and also passes. After the long wait, Jordan gets to his turn, plays a snow-covered forest, and follows this up by casting a Mana Crypt, and then taps these mana sources to cast a turn 1 Omnath, Locus of Mana. He then passes the turn to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Plains as his land, and then taps both of his lands to cast his commander, Sram, Senior Edificer. He then for 0 mana casts a Bonesaw, drawing from Sram's ability, and then he goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph taps for a blue mana to cast a Rapid Hybridization, targeting Sram. Sram is destroyed and replaced by a 3/3 green Frog Lizard, and Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays an island as his land, and then taps for 2 to cast a Sapphire Medallion, and with nothing left, ships the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and then for 2 mana casts a Warren Instigator. He then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3, and he then plays a Snow-Covered Forest as his land. He then goes to combat and swings Omnath at Nate, and Nate declares no blockers, and in response to moving to damage, Jordan taps both of his lands to generate 2 mana, pumping his commander. Nate takes 3, and then in his second main phase, Jordan, for 2 mana, casts an Okame Adversary due to the green Frog Lizard. Now, just so you know, moving forward, the amount of mana that Jordan has in his mana pool is going to be represented by the dice that is covering Omnath. Unfortunately, he did use too much mana for this Okame Adversary because we were just thinking, in a monocolored pod, who else is going to have a green permanent? But with the Frog Lizard saving the day, Jordan will re-add his mana in just a little bit. But with nothing left, Jordan gives his turn to Bill. Bill untaps, plays an Ancient Tomb, and then taking 2 damage from this Ancient Tomb, recasts his commander. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, plays an island, and then ships the turn to Nate. On his turn, Nate untaps, plays a Hanawar Battlements, and then goes to combat and swings his Warren Instigator at Joseph. Joseph declares no blockers and takes the 2 damage, but on the first strike damage, Nate puts a Goblin Rabblemaster onto the battlefield from Warren Instigator's ability, and then on the normal damage, he puts a Krenko 10th Street Kingpin onto the battlefield. There are no responses to any of these triggers, and Nate goes to pass the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, loses his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then plays a Snow-Covered Forest as his land. He then goes to combat and swings both of his creatures at Nate, pumping Omnath by tapping his 3 forests for mana. Nate takes 7 and Jordan draws off of the Okame, and with nothing left, passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and then taps his Ancient Tomb, taking 2 damage to help cast an Avacyn's Caller. He draws from Sram, and then as his land, he plays a Buried Ruin. He then uses his floating colorless to help cast an All That Glitters, again drawing and targeting his commander. He then for 0 mana casts a Paradise Mantle, and in response to the draw trigger, Joseph for 2 mana due to the Sapphire Medallion casts a Supreme Will, choosing to look at the top 4 cards of his library and putting 1 into his hand and putting the rest on the bottom. Bill then draws off Sram, the Paradise Mantle resolves, and Bill for 0 mana casts a Mana Crypt. He then uses his mana to cast a Darksteel Mutation targeting Omnath. Sram triggers off of the cast, and in response to this draw trigger, Jordan uses 1 of his floating mana to cast a Veil of Summer. It resolves, he draws a card, and then Bill draws a card off of Sram's ability, and the Darksteel Mutation resolves. Bill then equips his Paradise Mantle to his Frog Lizard, and then casts a Masterwork of Ingenuity. He draws another card off of Sram on cast, and as it enters the battlefield, he has it enter as a copy of Avacyn's Caller. He then goes to move to combat, and in response to moving phases before his mana disappears, Jordan casts a Force of Vigor, exiling his Pathbreaker Ibex instead of paying its mana cost, with his 2 targets being Darksteel Mutation and All That Glitters. In response to this cast, Nate for 3 mana hard casts a Deflecting Swat, changing the target to Bill's Mana Crypt instead of the Darksteel Mutation, and keeping the All That Glitters as a valid target. The Deflecting Swat successfully changes the targets, the Force of Vigor resolves, and still before moving to combat, Jordan uses his mana to cast a Berserk targeting Sram. Bill then goes to combat and then immediately to his second main phase, and for 1 white mana casts a Sigarda's Aid, using the Paradise Mantle equipped Frog Lizard to pay for the mana. With nothing left, Bill ships the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and then taps all of his mana sources to cast a Frantic Search, floating 1 blue mana. He draws 2 cards, discards a Tolarian Winds and an island, and then untaps 3 lands. He then, as his land for turn, plays a Sun-Scorched Desert. If you were paying attention to the introduction of this video, you can probably guess the next play. So he taps for 2 mana to cast a Ghostly Flicker, targeting the Sun-Scorched Desert and an island. Holding priority on this cast, he flashes out his commander for 3 mana, Naru Meha, Master Wizard. copying the Ghostly Flicker, and with the copy, targeting Sunscorched Desert and Naru Meha. With Naru Meha being exiled and brought back, he can again copy the Ghostly Flicker, essentially infinitely blinking Naru Meha and Sunscorched Desert, dealing enough damage to his opponents to win the game, and then stopping the loop by targeting 2 islands instead. Now that was a bit of a short one, so we will be having a game 2 here in just a moment, but I want to talk about this game a little bit because on the outside, it kind of looks like me as the blue player won out of nowhere uncontested. Now we decided on Naru Meha for this pod because we found the combo to be fairly interactable, especially from the other colors that were at the table. Really, any type of instant speed removal can stop this combo without needing a counter spell, and realistically the answers were there, they were just used a turn too early. Nate tapping out to cast his Deflecting Swat even though he had a Pyroblast in hand just kind of gave me an open door to win the game. I also did get incredibly lucky by drawing the Sunscorched Desert from the Frantic Search, but realistically these decks can deal with each other, and I wanted to just talk about it because there are a lot of answers that these decks are packed with. That being said, I know watching a blue player combo off on turn 4 from having 0 board state is not the most fun thing to watch, so we have a game number 2 for you, and this one is quite a bit longer than this first game, so let's get into the opening hands for game number 2. Bill won the dice roll for this game and is going first, and his opening hand contained a Windswept Heath, a Reliquary Tower, a Kite Shield, a Mox Opal, a Sigil of Distinction, an Infiltration Lens, and a Rune Stalactite. Joseph is going second, and he kept 7 cards, which were 2 islands, a Flooded Strand, a Spectral Sailor, a Charter Course, Impulse, and a Cyclonic Rift. Going third is Nate L, and his opening hand contained a Snow-Covered Mountain, a Hanowar Battlements, an Ancient Tomb, a Soul Ring, a Pyroblast, a Shared Animosity, and a Mog Salvage. And finally, going last is Jordan, who kept an opening hand of 6 cards, which were a Snow-Covered Forest, a Llanowar Elves, a Green Sun Zenith, a Priest of Titania, a Naturalize, a Garruk Primal Hunter, putting a Chord of Calling to the bottom of his library. Now with the opening hands out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Bill starts this game off by playing a Windswept Heath and passing the turn to Joseph. Joseph plays an island and also passes the turn. Nate plays an Ancient Tomb as his land and then takes 2 damage to tap it for mana to cast a Soul Ring. With nothing left, he ships the turn to Jordan. Jordan plays a Snow-Covered Forest and then taps it to cast a Llanowar Elves, and as he goes to pass the turn to Bill, Bill pays 1 life to crack his Windswept Heath to search up a Plains to the battlefield. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, plays a Plains, and then for 2 mana casts his commander, Sram. He then for 0 mana casts a Mox Opal, and follows this up by casting a Kite Shield, drawing on cast. Next, he plays a Sigil of Distinction, X equaling 0, again drawing, and then for 1 mana casts an Infiltration Lens. He again draws, and with nothing left, he goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph for a blue mana flashes out his Spectral Sailor. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, plays an island, goes to combat, swings his Sailor at Bill for 1 in the air, and then in his second main phase taps for 2 mana to cast Charter Course, drawing 2 cards. He then gives the turn to Nate. Nate plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and passes the turn. Jordan plays a Snow-Covered Forest and then taps for 2 to cast a Priest of Titania. He then gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, plays a Plains, and then casts a Rune Stalactite, drawing on cast. He then casts in a Quarter Shield, again drawing, and he then follows this up by casting a Gift of Immortality, targeting Sram, and again drawing a card. He then passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph plays an island and passes. Nate plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and then takes 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb to help cast Siege Gang Commander, floating a colorless mana. It resolves, and when it enters the battlefield, he makes 3 1/1 goblins. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and then taps for 3 mana to cast his commander, Omnath, Locus of Mana. In response to Omnath, Nate casts Mog Salvage without paying its cost since Joseph controls a island and he controls a mountain in order to destroy Bill's Mox Opal. The Omnath then resolves and Jordan gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and before he moves to his draw step for 1 white mana casts an Enlightened Suitor. It resolves and he searches up a Mana Crypt to the top of his library. He then plays a Reliquary Tower as his land for turn, and then for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. In response to this Mana Crypt, Joseph, for a blue mana, casts Spell Pierce. Bill decides to pay the 2 mana to have his Mana Crypt resolve, and he then taps this Mana Crypt to cast a Mask of Memory, again, drawing when it's cast. He then equips this mask to Sram and then goes to combat and declares Sram as an attacker at Joseph. In response to moving 2 blocks, Joseph for 2 mana casts a single target Cyclonic Rift, bouncing Sram to Bill's hand. There are no responses, Sram is bounced, and Bill, not able to recast his Sram, passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, plays a Flooded Strand as his land, and then for 2 mana casts a Mind Stone. He then ships the turn over to Nate. Nate plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and then casts a Goblin Matron. It resolves, and when it enters the battlefield, he searches a Goblin Recruiter to his hand, and he then casts this Goblin Recruiter, taking 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb. Now, he searched a lot of goblins to the top of his library, but the primary ones were the top 6, which were a Conspicuous Snoop, a Pashelix Mons, a Goblin Churgeon, a Mog Maniac, a Skirk Fire Marshal, and a Lightning Crafter. He puts his tutored cards to the top of his library and then passes the turn to Jordan. On Nate's end step, Jordan taps his 2 forests to float 2 mana and then store it into Omnath, and he then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and then taps his elves and uses some of his stored mana to cast a Vernal Bloom. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt flip, not taking damage, and he then taps for 2 mana to recast Sram. He then casts a Gorgon's Head, drawing on cast, and as his land for turn, he plays an Ancient Tomb. He follows this up by playing an Avacyn's Collar, again, drawing on cast. He then for 2 mana casts an All That Glitters, floating a colorless mana and drawing a card, and he then for 1 white mana casts an Agravian Find, targeting his Mox Opal. He returns the Mox Opal to his hand, and he then casts this Mox Opal. With nothing left to do and having drawn enough cards, he goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph for a blue mana casts a Mystical Tutor. The tutor resolves, and Joseph searches up a Day's Undoing to the top of his library. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, draws this Day's Undoing, and then for 3 mana, casts Day's Undoing. Nate, not wanting his entire tutor to go to waste, attempts to stop it by casting Pyroblast in response. However, in response to the Pyroblast, Joseph taps for a blue mana to cast a Flusterstorm. He points all 3 copies at Pyroblast, and in response to Flusterstorm, Jordan casts a Naturalize, targeting All That Glitters. When priority gets to him, Bill for a white mana casts Path to Exile, targeting Omnath. The Path resolves, Jordan gets a Snow-Covered Forest to the battlefield, the Naturalize then resolves, destroying All That Glitters. The Flusterstorm then resolves, countering Pyroblast, and Day's Undoing then resolves, and everybody shuffles their graveyards and hands into their library. They draw 7 cards, and then the turn immediately ends for Joseph. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and then for 2 mana casts a Ruby Medallion. He then takes 2 damage from Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Muxus, Goblin Grandee. He floats 1 colorless mana in this exchange, and off of the top 6 cards, he hits a single Goblin, which is a Changeling Berserker. When it enters the battlefield, he champions Muxus, and he then uses his colorless floating and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand to help cast a Sensei's Divining Top and Goblin Pile Driver. He then goes to combat and swings 12 damage at Joseph. Joseph declares no blockers, takes the damage, and Nate goes to pass the turn to Jordan, but on Nate's end step, Jordan for a green mana casts a Worldly Tutor. He searches a Beast Whisperer to the top of his library, and he then goes to his turn, untaps, draws this Beast Whisperer, and in his first main phase, casts an Emerald Medallion for 2 mana. He then for 3 mana casts a Beast Whisperer, and then for 4 mana recasts his commander Omnath, drawing on cast, and with no land drops to make, then passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, plays a Plains as his land for turn, and then takes 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb in his first main phase to help cast a Heavenly Blade Master. When it resolves, he attaches all of his equipments to it, making it essentially a 5/13 with Double Strike. He then moves the Mask of Memory from Heavenly Blade Master to Sram, and he then pays another mana to also move his Infiltrator's Lens over to Sram, making sure that no matter what people do, he's going to be drawing cards. He then goes to combat and swings this now 8/8 Sram at Joseph. Joseph decides to block it with his Spectral Sailor, and Bill draws 2 cards off of the Infiltrator's Lens. In his second main phase, Bill taps for 2 mana to cast a Darksteel Mutation, targeting Nate's Shape Changer, which is championing Muxus. So now it's a 0/1 insect with no abilities, which makes it a little bit more difficult to get his commander back. But with nothing left to do, Bill goes to his end step to pass the turn to Joseph and discards a Plains due to hand size. Joseph, on his turn, untaps, plays an island as his land, and then for 0 mana casts a Chrome Mox, which, when it enters the battlefield, he imprints Treasure Cruise 2. He then, for a blue mana, casts a Mystic Remora, and when that resolves, taps for 3 mana to cast a Spellseeker. When Spellseeker enters the battlefield, he gets a Cyclonic Rift to his hand, and with nothing left, passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his first main phase, taps his Soul Ring to activate his Sensei's Divining Top, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library, and he then takes 2 damage from Ancient Tomb to help cast a Brash Taunter. He then goes to combat and swings 7 total damage at Bill and his pile driver at Joseph, which at this point is a 13-2, with protection from blue. Bill blocks 1 creature and takes 6 damage, and Joseph takes the full 13. With nothing left, Nate shifts the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, plays a Snow-Covered Forest as his land, and then for 8 mana casts a Green Sun Zenith, X equaling 7. He doesn't pay for Mystic Remora, so Joseph draws, and when Green Sun resolves, he gets a Nyx Bloom Ancient to the battlefield. He then very easily generates enough mana to cast an Orin Frostfang, drawing from Beast Whisperer when it's cast, and he follows this play up by again easily generating enough mana to cast a Bellowing Tangleworm. He then goes to combat and swings Omnath at Bill for 3 damage and draws off of Orin Frostfang. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep loses his mana crypt trigger, taking a 3, and he then moves his Mask of Memory from Sram to his Heavenly Blade Master. He then goes to combat and swings both of his creatures at Joseph, and in response to moving to blockers, Joseph for 2 mana casts a Winds of Rebuke targeting the Heavenly Blade Master. In response to this cast, Nate taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card and put the Divining Top back on top of his library, and then Winds of Rebuke resolves, bouncing the creature, and everybody mills 2 cards. Joseph then takes 2 damage from Sram, and in his second main phase, Bill takes 2 damage from Ancient Tomb to help recast his Heavenly Blade Master. He then for 1 white mana casts a Sigarda's Aid, not paying for Mystic Remora, and then goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph pays 1 life to crack his Flooded Strands, and in response to this crack, Jordan casts a Nature's Claim targeting Joseph's Chrome Mox, also not paying for Mystic Remora. The Nature's Claim resolves, the Chrome Mox is destroyed, and Joseph gains 4 life, and then searches up an island to the battlefield off of his Flooded Strands crack. He then, still in Bill's end step, for 1 blue mana casts an Opt, scrying a card to the bottom and then drawing a card. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his upkeep does not pay for Mystic Remora, and then plays an island as his land, and wanting to hold up that Cyclonic Rift mana, passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and then takes 2 damage from Ancient Tomb to help cast a Treasure Nabber. He then goes to combat and swings a total of 5 1/1s at Bill, and before moving to blockers, taps his Brash Taunter to make his now 11 power Goblin Pile Driver fight Brash Taunter. Knowing the damage is coming his way, Joseph for 2 mana casts a Reality Shift, targeting the Brash Taunter, trying to remove it before it takes damage. In response to Reality Shift, Nate taps for a red mana to cast Red Elemental Blast, trying to protect this activation. In response to the Red Elemental Blast, Joseph for 2 more mana casts a single target Cyclonic Rift, again targeting the Taunter. In response to this Cyclonic Rift, Nate has the answer he needs and casts a Pyroblast. Joseph, really looking for an answer, taps for a blue mana to cast a Whispers of the Muse, drawing a card, and with nothing left, the Pyroblast resolves, the Cyclonic Rift is countered, and the Red Elemental Blast resolves, countering the Reality Shift. Joseph then takes 11 damage from the activation, and Bill decides to block 1 of the 1/1s and takes 4 damage. Nate then goes to pass the turn to Jordan, and on Nate's end step, Jordan taps his available mana to store it with Omnath and pump up his commander. Jordan then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and then casts a Destiny Spinner, drawing on cast from Beast Whisperer. He follows this up by playing an Azusa, Lost But Seeking, again drawing on cast. He then plays a Snow-Covered Forest as his land, and he then taps for 13 mana to cast a Finale of Devastation, X equaling 10. In response to this finale, Bill, due to Sigarda's aid, flashes out a Paradise Mantle, drawing a card, and equipping it to Heavenly Blade Master when it enters. There are no more responses to finale, and Jordan gets a Crater Hoof Behemoth to the battlefield. In response to the Behemoth's ETB, Bill casts in All That Glitters, targeting Sram, again drawing a card and just looking for an answer. There are no answers to be found, and all of Jordan's creatures get essentially +20/+20 due to both the finale and the Crater Hoof, and they also have haste. Jordan then goes to combat and overruns the board with his stompy green creatures, dealing enough damage to his opponents to win the game. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed our mono-colored pod. We may do something like this in the future where we do some more gimmicky or off-the-cuff games outside of our season, really just as a way to play some commanders who might not normally make it into one of our normal seasons in more of a balanced way, while still sticking to our casually competitive theme of playing some higher-powered decks. If you have some suggestions for some of these themed games, feel free to let us know in the comments. But that really is going to do it for this video. There's not really too much I wanted to talk about that last game. I thought it was really fun and interactive. Multiple people were threatening a win. People were doing things, drawing cards, and it was a really fun game to be a part of. And again, we hope you enjoyed watching it. That being said, that is all we have for this video. We will see you next week with our Season 3 finale. But until then, I am Joseph, this is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.